In 2022, we were introduced to the Elden Lord, a title which holds much esteem in the lands between. And in 2022, we were also reminded of the God of War, a title that has transcended realms. But in just 1 week, both of these titles will be put to the test to earn a title that might be even more powerful: the 2022 Game of the Year. So will God of War be the two-time 2018-2022 gaming champion of the world, or will From Software be bringing home another championship title belt after Sekiro won it years prior? It's time to break these titles down and see who, in my opinion, is most deserving. What is going on, Technically? My name is Billy the Squid, and if you go back and look at my past videos and my video repertoire overall, you would probably just call me a From Software shill and write this video off, because of course I'm going to give Elden Ring the Game of the Year. But believe it or not, I am a huge God of War fan, and God of War Ragnarok really has thrown a wrench into what I thought was going to be a surefire win for Elden Ring going into the Game of the Year awards. So let's not waste any more time, and let's start breaking down these titles and seeing which one will come out on top. And first, I want to break out the most boring fact: the sales numbers. And while numbers of copies sold might be boring, there is an interesting caveat to this in the fact that God of War Ragnarok was a PlayStation exclusive. If we go into their sales numbers, Elden Ring currently has sold 17.5 million copies of the game, and in its first 2 weeks sold 12 million copies. This is an all-time high for From Software, and the fact that they sold on every console and PC imaginable makes it so that this game was easily accessible to the entire gaming sphere if they so chose to purchase it. Then comes in God of War Ragnarok, which is a PlayStation exclusive, but is being sold on both the PS4 and PS5 versions. It, in its first week, has sold 5.1 million copies and is steadily increasing as the weeks go on. It should also be noted that God of War Ragnarok is the fastest selling PlayStation exclusive to date. If you put these numbers side by side, it is actually pretty on point, both games sales wise, with the 5.1 million and rising being on one console, whereas Elden Ring had the 12 million on all consoles. Given this logic, I feel like it is appropriate to assume that if God of War had been sold on the Xbox and on the PC fronts, that it would be comparable in the 2-week margin to what Elden Ring has sold, if not even a little bit higher. Now, I don't want to dwell on these numbers too much because I don't think sales actually matter that much when it comes to the Game of the Year award. I just did want to bring that up because let's be honest here. If sales numbers meant that the game was going to win Game of the Year, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet would be a surefire thing because in their first 3 days, they sold 10 million copies. So let's not dwell on the sales numbers anymore, and let's move on to the actual gameplay elements. And let's start with sound. And as far as audio goes, let's start with the voice acting. Elden Ring has a slew of characters, all fully voice acted, and it does a good job at bringing the lands between into a proper light, giving character motivations, and I do genuinely feel that the voice acting is done adequately for this game, with a few standout performances such as Snaky Boy Rykard winning over people's hearts, as well as Alexander the Pot Guy giving us those Solera Vestora feels and really making it a heartbreaking moment at the end of his storyline. That being said, I do consider this voice acting adequate. It was obviously a point that they didn't put a lot of effort into because other gameplay aspects were more important for From Software than what the voice acting was. I do give props where props are due. The boss's voice acting is probably the top tier from Software games so far. But the overall NPC voice acting, while it gets the point across and it conveys the situation that the lands between are in, there's really not that many standout voice acting among them. The same cannot be said for God of War Ragnarok, though, as the voice acting and motion capture in general just goes above and beyond what we have seen in gaming up to this point. I genuinely think that this is probably the best acted game that has ever come out, even beating The Last of Us Part 2, which many consider to be the gaming cinematic masterpiece of its day and age. I think this goes above and beyond that, and it definitely trounces whatever God of War 2018 did. From heavy impact characters such as Thor, Odin, Kratos, and Atreus, to even some of the side characters that are meant to be more comic relief, such as Fri HERE and Skildir. I feel like everybody that came in and lent their voice to this game really gave it 110%, and it genuinely shows in how everything is portrayed within this game. And on the other end of the sound spectrum, we have the ambient noises and soundtracks. And this is somewhere where I think both games do what they're trying to do justice. God of War really gives you those epic roars whenever combat is going. The boss scores are extremely good, and I do feel like each one of the realms has an appropriate sound for where you're going to be at. It makes you feel more immersed in each of those realms and makes each of the realms feel more unique. I'm not going to deep dive into the mix of each of these soundtracks, but while the God of War soundtrack wasn't dampened enough so that I didn't notice it or didn't care about it in combat or exploration moments, it also never really hit an all-time high. It was just kind of a consistent, this is pretty good all the way throughout, and I think that's good enough. But we are talking about the game of the year, and I don't think good enough as far as soundtrack goes is really enough for this title in particular, and this is somewhere where I feel Elden Ring does have the edge on God of War Ragnarok. From Software has always been a savant when it comes to their character soundtracks, from boss themes to overworld themes to your standard combat encounters where the tension heightens and then dampens as the combat encounter decreases. And I feel like the open world has made this even more abundantly clear how good From Software is at creating compositional music for these games. And one of my favorite things about From Software is they are not afraid to play around with silence. If they want you to feel isolated, if they want you to feel alone, if they want you to be taking more stuff in with your eyes than with your ears, they will just cut the score. And I think this is something that is underrated in the gaming space, where you think you need an audio stimulus all the time. Sometimes just your own footsteps and nothing else is enough. But as I said before, the boss scores and environmental scores are peak audio design when it comes to a video game. And I feel like the ambience in Elden Ring, as far as the soundtrack goes, is fairly unmatched in the gaming space. Just like the vast openness of the lands between, the gaming space is full of many different genres that fill it. And I want to break down real quick how each one of these games lent its hand to each of their genres and made their genres of gaming better, because I feel like both of these games did exceptional things in those regards. Starting with Elden Ring, this brought the open world back to the forefront of gaming. We haven't had a game this good as far as open world content goes since The Elder Scrolls Skyrim, in my opinion. And there's a reason why that game continues to sell over and over with every re-release that it does, is because that genre was starving. It was starving for a king to lead it forward and rejuvenate the love for open world gaming. And while they didn't get a king, they did get an Elden Lord. I feel like Elden Ring single-handedly brought the open world genre back from being something that was starting to get openly mocked for its lack of originality and just the same wash, rinse, repeat, repetitive cycle of gaming. And while many will say that the user experience for Elden Ring as far as open world games go was not optimal for open world gamers, the numbers tell themselves that people wanted something that was less hands-holdy, less go from point A to point B because we tell you to, and more of an open exploration where the player is truly in control of what they want to do. Bring this to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where you have your action-adventure linear gameplay of God of War Ragnarok. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing, because linear gameplay, when done correctly, keeps the player engrossed in the story, engrossed in the world, and engrossed in the moment-to-moment action that the game brings forward. Pacing is extremely important in these games, and God of War Ragnarok does an almost perfect job with its pacing throughout the entirety of the game. Every high moment is met with an appropriate calm moment where exposition can be given, character development can happen, and the story can overall extend out. And two things need to happen for this style of game to truly shine. It needs to have amazing story and good gameplay to back it up. And I want to dive into the story of these games next, because a lot of people are upset that Elden Ring, as well as being nominated for Game of the Year and several other awards, has an award proposed for Best Narrative. And while I will agree, the Elden Ring narrative is the best narrative that From Software has ever come up with, getting George R.R. Martin on the phone and having him lay out an entire landscape's backstory that then From Software can build their own story upon was an exceptional idea, and I think it was very well executed. That being said, in standard From Software fashion, very little of that story is actually given to the players directly. If a player has to actively go in and deep dive into what is going on in the lands between, or else the cutscenes that they see from boss fight to boss fight and the dialogue that the characters give isn't going to make 100% most sense. And while I do think this is a unique form of narrative delivery, I feel like the narrative is lost on a good majority of the player base if they're not willing to go out and actively look for the items themselves, or look up somebody on YouTube that's willing to spell it out for them. And the underlying story there is exceptionally good, but again, the delivery does not lend strength to the best narrative argument. So as far as that goes, I do think the story is one of the lower points for Elden Ring. It is certainly not a low point for God of War though, because that's all this game is about. This game from start to finish is nothing but an extremely well-crafted story that goes through multiple different characters, character development all across the board, and is probably one of the most well put together, if you combine it with the 2018 God of War, one of the best put together story arcs from start to finish that I have seen in gaming. I feel like this is God of War's main strength. It rejuvenated, revitalized, and dare I say reinvented how story-based gaming can be delivered. So if you're still with me through the halfway point of this video, I just want to thank you so much for watching. We're going to be getting into the gameplay for the entire second half of this video, but before we do, if you wouldn't mind hitting a like on the video and letting me know down below what your game of the year is and why, because I'm very curious to see other people's opinions. Also, if you really had a good time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We will be doing a lot more content of this caliber moving forward. But let's get into the gameplay. With both of these games coming off of successful prior titles, it would be extremely easy for the developers to just kind of wash, rinse, repeat the gameplay mechanics and give you a little bit of more of the same from what you expect from the prior titles. While Elden Ring isn't a true sequel to the Dark Souls games, it is obvious that it is built on the same engine and uses quite a few of the same mechanics that the Dark Souls games have, making it more of a spiritual successor than a true one, but it is still in the same vein of that From Software formula that the Souls games, Bloodborne, and so on have built. Meanwhile, God of War Ragnarok looks to expand on what God of War 2018 had built as far as the combat systems go, and I feel like both of these games do enough to differentiate themselves from their predecessors while still maintaining that semblance of familiarity that the prior titles have given to their player base. Talking about God of War Ragnarok for a second, if you came from God of War 2018 or played it recently before Ragnarok came out, this is going to feel extremely familiar to you. Almost too familiar in some instances. It does feel like a direct pickup from God of War 2018 going into Ragnarok, as the game starts you off with both the axe and the blades of chaos, which I think is a very good step at creating a little bit more variety in the combat systems. One of my critiques of God of War 2018 was the combat got a bit samey for a while. God of War Ragnarok seeks to alleviate this by giving you a few different options that 2018 just didn't have available. First, they gave you a lot more shield options. Shields have a lot more of a benefit to you in this game, and there are different shields for different circumstances. If you want to be a parry god, there is a parry shield for you. If you want to just turtle up and tank behind a great shield, you can do that as well. If you want a shield that's going to run you across the battlefield to be able to deflect an enemy's attack, then you can do that as well. Different shields for different circumstances. And while I don't see anybody actually mixing and matching and swapping these out given on scenarios, it will help you facilitate different playstyles, and I think that is a very good thing. On top of this, you get a third weapon, the Dropnir Spear, which kind of fits a middle ground between the axe and the Blades of Chaos. It's also worth noting at this point that I played this game on Give Me No Mercy mode. I tend to like my games with a little bit of degree of difficulty, so that is where my opinion is coming off of. I didn't play it on Give Me God of War mode, but I also didn't play it on Give Me a Story mode either. But going back to runic attacks, this is something that I feel like was dropped in Ragnarok as compared to 2018. The runic attacks that you find in the game seem a lot more fewer and far between. Maybe I just missed a bunch of them. If I did, let me know down in the comments below. But throughout the course of the game, I only got probably 2 or 3 runic attacks for each one of these weapons. Same thing with the relics. As far as the main game goes, I found very few relics that actually changed things in a way that I wanted to actively use them. Most of them were just either a rage boost, a health boost, or something like that. The one I ended up settling on was the slow-mo relic. And from what I'm seeing in the end game, there are a significant amount more relics to come by in the end game, so that's refreshing. But during the main game, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more. And it seems like both of these aspects were kind of brought down a little bit so that they could raise up the skill tree, give you more abilities on demand that you could mix and match whenever you feel like it through those systems. They added a lot of moves that were runic attacks from 2018 and put them into the skill tree for Ragnarok. I feel like this is a good move, makes it more accessible for everybody, and gives you a little bit more mix and match. I also enjoy that the more you use these moves, they actually level up within the skill tree and get bonus modifiers if you use them so often. I think this is a really good way to incentivize a wider array of playstyle, using more moves more often. It's just good. Combine this with the ability to play as Atreus throughout different courses of the game, and having multiple different companion characters fighting alongside you that all kind of control in their own unique way. This gives a lot more variety to the combat systems of God of War Ragnarok that I found really refreshing, and I never really felt stale controlling the characters specifically. Boss variety is also a huge step up from 2018, and I feel like they did it really well. Each one of the bosses is very unique. There are very few recycled bosses, and the ones that are recycled have a unique twist whenever they are recycled that makes it more unique and engaging than what we got with 2018, where there was like 6 Dowie fights. Fun factor for these bosses is up there as well. I really enjoy how this game controls in a 1v1 scenario, and I wish they would have leaned into that a little bit more with the basic mobs, because in the boss fights, I was engaged 100% of the time. These were my favorite moments from this game, was going 1v1 with these bosses, or even some of the duo fights I feel like were extremely well done. If the story is the #1 aspect of this game, I do feel like the boss fights are the #2 aspect. God of War Ragnarok really knocked it out of the park with this one. The same cannot be said, however, for the random enemy variety. Perhaps the games that I typically play have spoiled me as far as enemy variety goes. I tend to like Final Fantasies, the Souls games, Castlevania, stuff like that. Games with very large bestiaries and a lot of different unique characters to interact with on the combat front. And while I will say this is a big step up from 2018, Ragnarok still, I feel, drops the ball in this regard with just not having enough enemy variety to really keep things interesting on a combat level in those encounters. They tend to lean more into the mixing and matching of enemy varieties more than making unique enemy varieties themselves, which I would have preferred the latter. There are a few moments when I'm getting into a fresh new realm, something that I hadn't seen before. The environment is beautifully done, and then I walk into the first combat encounter and it's just more grim. This kind of repetition started making these combat encounters feel a little bit samey, and while it didn't take me completely out of the moment, it did open up some frustration factors, as I felt like they were mobbing me more than they were actually trying to create unique and engaging combat encounters. That being said, whenever a new enemy did pop up, and often they were a mid-boss style enemy, I was all in. It made all of those encounters feel a lot more special because there was so much of the same in between each one of them. So I don't know if that was the intention, but that was how I felt with it. And it did highlight those moments, even if the other moments were to a detriment. Which is a damn shame, because I think what suffers the worst from this is Ragnarok itself. Having this storming of the Aesir stronghold, all these realms converging, gods fighting in the backgrounds, everything going down, the pinnacle of what this game is supposed to be. And what do you get as a mob counter? Just more Einherjar. As far as the combat encounters go themselves and actually playing them out, I'm fully willing to admit that there's probably a skill issue in regards to God of War Ragnarok. I'm not the best player with it, but the way that the combat encounters, there were a few frustrating points with them, especially the mob encounters. I think the bosses were done perfectly, as I've stated before. But as far as the mob encounters go, it felt like the enemies had an almost homing style to their attacks, whether they were melee or ranged. It seemed like if a melee attack was coming at me, even if I thought my spacing was good, they would slide into me and still hit me, making it so that any attack that came my way, I just got in the habit of either blocking, parrying, or dodging, assuming that they were going to hit me, because 9 times out of 10 they would come into that range. Or the ranged attacks coming in at me when I'm trying to focus on the melees and just sniping me out of nowhere, often 1 or 2 shotting me, just because of how much damage the ranged attacks do. I do have protanopia color blindness, so that color wheel that's around you that kind of shows off where the attacks are coming from that are off screen might have had something to do with it, but I do feel like that claustrophobic camera does sometimes have a detriment to the combat systems, just by not having enough wide view to be able to see what all is going on, making a few of the attacks that you get hit by feel a little bit cheap. It's also worth noting that the hand-holdiness of the puzzle solving is a little bit annoying, not having more than 10 seconds to figure out a puzzle before the AI gives it to you. Just a little bit frustrating. All in all, though, none of these frustration factors were enough for me to put down the game. I was locked in from start to finish, and I genuinely think this is the best game that Santa Monica Studios has made, and I'm excited to see what they do in the next step of not only this franchise, but future franchises. All right, folks, it's Elden Ring time. Riding heavily on the coattails of the Dark Souls series, From Software put a lot of that Dark Souls charm into Elden Ring. I've said before that this is more of a spiritual successor to the Souls series than its own unique IP, and that shows a lot in the gameplay aspects of it. Whenever Elden Ring originally got launched, a lot of people had gripes with the reuse of assets and animations from the Souls games into this. Their argument that this is a new IP, it should have completely new assets and they shouldn't be recycling as much as they did. I feel like this could have been a fair criticism to make if From Software didn't innovate and move that system forward in a extremely positive way. And I feel like with what we got with Elden Ring, they did exactly that. Feeding off of the muscle memory of their fan base, the basic mechanics are very familiar to you, but the innovations that they did, such as the jump button, such as the stealth mechanics, such as the interchangeable Ashes of War, give a lot more variety to a game that's predecessor already had a significant amount of variety to it. This game genuinely feels like a culmination of everything that From Software has done in this hardcore action RPG genre, pushed into one. There's a little bit of Sekiro here, there's a little bit of Bloodborne here, there's a lot of Dark Souls all throughout the game, but then it also has its unique Elden Ring moments. Ashes of War is a wonderful overhaul to the weapon art system established in Dark Souls 3, where you can actually mix and match what Ash of War you want based on what weapon you're using, with a few caveats that can't be interchanged, as well as having those big boy weapons, the boss weapons and stuff like that, have a more unique feel to them, having a locked Ash of War, so that they genuinely feel a little bit different than your common everyday weaponry. Combine this with the largest spell book that I have ever seen, both from the sorceries front, pyromancy's front, miracles front, so on and so forth, and you have a game that has more variety than I think any other game of its kind has. This sets the player up to build their character any way that they see fit, with a stat system that is familiar and intuitive so that you can go into whatever build you want to go into. This stat system, however, does limit some of the variety that a character can get into with this game. With so many different options in your playthrough, you're not going to be able to play with all of these new toys. You will eventually lean into a playstyle and kind of start specializing in that playstyle, which will make your individual character feel a little bit less unique and have a little bit fewer options than, say, what you have as Kratos in God of War Ragnarok. But the overall breadth of options that are before you, and given the fact that respecing is the easiest that it's ever been in a From Software game, you still have that ability to mix and match. And if a playstyle isn't working out for you and you're not really enjoying it, or you just want something fresh, you have the ability to do so quite easily. There's also a crafting system, which I think maybe 5 people actually actively use if you're doing a bow build, a bombs build, or a perfume build. Other than that, it's kind of suboptimal. World building wise, From Software has done an amazing job making it so that the open world feels like you want to explore it. The open world segments are extremely engaging on that exploration front, and there's enough variety from each of the individual locations that you go to keep your senses engaged with what you're going for. Combine this with a map system that is both simple but effective in facilitating exploration, while also having a few little clues on potential areas that you can go and find things at, on top of an open world that is riddled with clues and markers that make you actively want to see something off in the distance and then go to that thing. And 9 times out of 10, you're able to do that. The addition of a mount system makes traversal the easiest that it's ever been, on top of you having fast travel right out of the gate, which ironically enough, I didn't realize was a thing until like my 5th hour into the game, which is one gripe I can bring up about the game. And this is in standard From Software fashion. Very little is explained to you on most of the facets of this game. It is kind of a trial by fire situation. And if you're not familiar or ready for that kind of an experience, it can be quite punishing for you. Not just in the combat scenarios, but just in how the game works overall. There's no real explanation on almost anything, so you kind of got to figure it out on your own or use a third party source to look it up. That being said, figuring this game out is fun, and I feel like the open world is a nice little sandbox for new players to kind of get a taste for how these games work and facilitate it. It seems like every wide open area is your quote unquote tutorial area for that segment. And then as you go into the dungeons, those are like your individual levels in your hard mode encounters. You learn the game from the open world and then take those skills into the dungeons and legacy dungeons of the game. And they did a surprisingly good job filling this open world with unique things to interact with. There's a lot of unique enemies, some enemies actually fighting each other. It feels the most lived in out of a world that I have seen in a very long time, along with plenty of sub dungeons to go into, which some people might consider a little bit samey, but I feel like the sameness is with a purpose. Each one of these dungeons, say the mines, the catacombs, the caves and stuff, each serve a different purpose to the player, and being able to recognize them right out of the gate and know what you're getting into whenever you dive into each of these, I feel like is a good thing and helps kind of give another learning curve to the game where, oh, I need materials, let's go seek out a mine. Oh, I need more crafting materials, let's go seek out a cave. Stuff along those lines. And there's always something good at the end of each one of these encounters, whether it's something you can use or not so much, but there is at least something worthwhile to everybody's build at some point. And while it may be a slog for some people going through dungeon after dungeon and not getting anything that is actually useful for their build, it does make those moments where you find something for your build that much more engaging, or potentially you find something that's not in your build and makes you want to change your build. And variety is something that Elden Ring comes with in spades, both in the normal enemy variety as well as the boss variety. Normal enemies are scattered throughout the lands, between each area having its own unique flora and fauna that you can interact with. And while there are some sameness, such as the soldiers of Godric turning into the Carrion Knights, just kind of being palette swaps of each other, there's a few instances of that, but there is quite a bit of uniqueness to each one of these areas to make them feel separate from one another, and each one of these enemies to feel separate from one another. And the variety doesn't just stop with the enemies, the bosses of this game. There's more bosses in this game than there are in some franchises. But the number can seem a little bit inflated in that regard, as what is truly a boss and what is just an elite enemy in a boss skin. To break it down, there are 238 boss encounters in Elden Ring. This is 238 encounters, not 238 unique bosses total. For that number, it's in the 70s range as far as unique bosses go. But even then, some of those bosses are recycled as elite enemies out in the overworld. And some of these bosses, while they maintain being bosses, are recycled bosses throughout the lands between. That being said, there are 30 plus unique bosses to the game, and even if you just wanted to go and speed run through the game, only doing the absolutely required bosses, that still leaves you with 13 boss encounters. So even at its lowest point, Elden Ring still has a boss number that is at least on par with major games and blows a lot of other games completely out of the water in this genre. And that singular playthrough is important because I do feel like Elden Ring has the better replayability out of the two games. Just with the pure scope of what you can build in Elden Ring, you're going to want to go in and make a new character that can use some of the stuff that you picked up before that you found interesting but not interesting enough to respec into, and also give you more time to explore, because I doubt anybody is going to 100% explore this game in their first playthrough. They're going to want to go and find areas that they missed initially and see what kind of secrets hide behind them. Whereas God of War Ragnarok has an amazing end game. Both of these games have a really good end game after you beat the main story bosses, giving you enough challenges after the credits roll to keep that playthrough going a little bit longer in post. Not to mention that replayability plays into the PvP and co-op systems that the game introduces. Yes, this game has online functionalities, and while it is a bit niche as far as the PvP systems go, having that co-op ability, while it's not the best executed co-op in the world, far from it actually, it still gives that a little bit more incentive to come back and play it just because you have a buddy that might be playing it for the first time and you want to play it through with them. But I feel like God of War Ragnarok's only replayability is the replayability of playing the game with all of that stuff that you acquired initially, as well as playing the game on a harder difficulty, whether that is from a fresh character or a new game plus character, things that both Elden Ring and God of War have in common. So bosses obviously have quantity in Elden Ring, but do they have quality? And I feel like in a lot of situations, these are some of the better bosses that From Software has put out. I don't think that there are particularly any that reach the highest of highs that some of the prior games bosses have gotten to, but I do feel like across the board, this is the most evened out as far as boss quality goes. And I feel like a lot of that comes down to them overloading some of these bosses, either with combos that never seem to end, minimal windows to attack, or just AoE spam out the ass. And with new dodging mechanics that they introduced with the jumping system, jumping over attacks is something that they want to encourage, but I don't feel like having AoE spam bosses is exactly the way to do that. So whilst these bosses don't reach the highest of highs, I do feel like there's a few standouts, such as Rykard being one of the best gimmick bosses that From Software has ever made, and Moog, Lord of Blood, just being one of the coolest bosses and probably my standout boss of Elden Ring. Except for that whale. That damn whale should go in the trash can with the moon presence and never be seen again. Way to make another underwhelming final boss From Software. But now that we've weighed the pros and cons of these games, none of that actually matters if these games didn't resonate with an audience. Impact on gaming is important, and you want to nominate and award this to whatever game had the most impact on gaming overall. And this is honestly the deciding factor for me. I feel like both of these games are well deserving of their Game of the Year title. I feel like both of these games' pros vastly outweigh the cons, and in a different world, in a different like parallel universe, both of these games have won Game of the Year in their respective galaxies. But this is my mainline Earth, and as far as Game of the Year goes, I feel like Elden Ring just simply had a bigger impact on the gaming space overall. While recency bias might lean people more towards God of War since it's fresh, new, and exciting, I feel the opposite, that Elden Ring has been around since the beginning of the year and has kind of stayed a staple of gaming throughout this entire year. It never really had a significant drop off, and even when it did, it's still higher than a lot of games' highs ever get to. Coming out of 2021, where gaming felt fairly underwhelming, Elden Ring was something that a lot of people were looking forward to, and it completely rejuvenated the gaming space for quite a few people, myself included. This is one of the few games where I've seen people completely out of their genre end up picking it up and loving it. It was one of those games where everybody came out and wanted to be Elden Lord, and both the co-op and the PvP systems have been something that have given the game a lot more longevity than what most single player story titles will. And as far as game of the year goes, you want the game of the year to be the game that touched the most amount of people. And unfortunately, since God of War Ragnarok was a PlayStation exclusive, that significantly limits the scope that this game could have potentially had on the player base overall. I really do wish these awards shows lean more into the PlayStation exclusive game of the year, Xbox exclusive game of the year, PC game of the year, and so on and so forth. But as far as an overall game of the year goes, I feel like Elden Ring encompasses everything that that award stands for. It brought the gaming community back together in one way or another and made it so that people looked forward to gaming again. God of War Ragnarok is a masterpiece, don't get me wrong. It deserves every praise that I'm sure it's going to get in the Game Awards. And if you tell me down below that you think God of War Ragnarok is more deserving, I will 100% agree with you, because this is an extremely difficult decision. You don't often get two titans in gaming that come so close to each other to make this award so difficult to give out. And it might be a little bit of my bias towards the From Software formula that is leaning me towards Elden Ring, but I think I've put enough evidence forward in this video to make it as unbiased as I possibly could have done. So let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. What is your game of the year? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. More videos will be coming out into 2023. And until next time, Tenna Crew, much love. Bye-bye.